Hi everyone. In this part of the series, we're going to look at another game by Magnus Carlsen and another line of the QGD exchange variation. So we have d4, d5, c4, the Queen's Gambit. e6 is the Queen's Gambit declined, knight c3, and now in previous parts of this series, we looked at the move knight to f6, very natural, developing move, supporting the d5 pawn and lending support to e4 as well. All right, and we recommended playing the exchange variation here by taking on d5. Black recaptures with a pawn. And then we want to get our minor pieces developed, and so we recommended bishop to g5. We want to get that piece developed first so that we can push e3 and that bishop will be outside of the pawn chain. And we can develop the light squared bishop next. However, going back, sometimes instead of knight f6, Black decides to develop his kingside minor pieces in the reverse order. So it's quite popular for Black to play bishop to e7. Looks a little strange, but the point of it is to keep control of the g5 square, so we won't be able to get our bishop to g5. Well, if we see this move, we'll play an exchange variation anyway. We'll take on d5, and now since we can't post the bishop on g5, we're going to put it on the next best square, f4. Okay, so that's a good place for the bishop as well. All right, in this position, a very common move for Black is c6. There are other moves he can play. He can play knight f6 at this point. He can play knight b d7, for example. But c6 is very common. And do you remember the point of that move? So that move usually indicates that Black wants to develop the light squared bishop, and presumably to the f5 square. And c6 helps prepare that because it defends d5 against a possible queen to b3, and it also opens a diagonal so that Black can respond with queen to b6, protecting b7 if White's queen ends up on b3. So that's a signal the light squared bishop is about to be developed. So our recommendation in this position is to stop it. Queen to c2, control that f5 square. In a similar position, we talked about the move e3 in our last part of the series, and then bishop comes out to f5 and queen to f3. That doesn't work here because the bishop is on f4 and it's in our way. The queen on f3 would not be attacking the bishop on f5. So instead, we play queen c2. We want to control this square, make it hard for Black to develop that light squared bishop. Okay, now a natural follow-up for Black is knight to f6, getting ready to castle. And now we're going to play a strange looking move. We're going to play h3. Now the purpose of that move is, in this position, Black may want to go knight to h5 and attack our bishop. And we don't want to give Black the bishop pair. We don't want him to be in sole possession of the two bishops. So this is a pretty good bishop on this diagonal right now, and we would like Black to use his own good dark squared bishop to trade for ours if he wants to get rid of our bishop. h3 creates a nice little escape square for our bishop, so that if Black plays knight to h5, we can hide the bishop on the h2 square. So for example, if we didn't do that and we played the natural e3, which is our usual follow-up, so that the bishop is outside of the pawn chain, well then knight h5 could come and Black's going to be able to trade off our bishop. If we save it by moving it to e5, well, he can simply attack it with the other knight. And so there's no way to preserve the bishop. We'll have to give it up for a knight. So because of that, we're going to recommend playing h3 to give ourselves a little hiding square right there. This move also has the bonus of being able to keep the light square bishop off of the g4 square. So now it has nowhere good to develop at all. All right, so black typically castles here, and now we can play e3 to get the light squared bishop out. Okay, knight b7, bishop d3, rook e8, getting the rook centralized and also opening up the f8 square for the knight. Now, in previous videos, we recommended developing this knight to e2 so that we can push the pawn to f3 and then the central pawn to e4. But in this particular line with the bishop on f4, we prefer actually to post that knight on f3 and go for a different plan entirely. You can actually go for the knight e2 plan, and you can expand with f3 and e4, so if you want to experiment with that, feel free. But we're going to show you a different way to play. So we're going to put the knight more centralized on f3. We're not going to worry about expanding the pawns in the center. We're going to do something different. So here, let's pick up with a game, Magnus Carlsen versus Mamedyarov. And this was from the 2019 Rapid World Championships, round 13. So Mamedyarov played knight f8. That's why the rook moved over. The knight can get to the g6 square next. Carlsen castled short. I should mention that it is possible to castle long in both this position and in the other lines we looked at when the bishop was on g5. Long castles is a sharper way to play, and sometimes Carlsen does that. Okay, but short castles is a good move. The king is now safe. Knight g6 comes. Notice that hits the bishop here. So good thing we have that square available. We're going to move it back to h2 out of the way. And now black decides to play bishop to d6 to challenge our dark squared bishop, and we're happy to give it up for the other bishop rather than for a knight. So white trades here, black takes back, and now here's the new plan that Carlsen goes for. He wants to enact what's called the minority attack. In this particular pawn structure that arises in the QGD, black has more pawns on the queen side of the board than white does. So white has only 3 pawns to black's 4. So white is said to have a minority of pawns. If you take the central pawns out of the equation, you can say we have a 2 to 3 minority here. And when you have this particular pawn structure, white can launch what's known as the minority attack, which involves getting the b pawn to the b5 square in order to force a weakness in the black pawn structure. For example, if white can get the pawn to b5, he can exchange it on c6 here, and if black takes back, he'll have a weak backward c6 pawn, and white would be able to place a rook on c1 and attack it. Or if after the pawn comes to b5, black decides to exchange this way, then he'll have a weak isolated d pawn. So either way, if white is able to get his pawn to b5 without a concession, then black is going to have a structural weakness. And this is called the minority attack. Let's see how Carlsen does it. He begins by playing rook a b1. He's supporting the pawn to come forward to b4. That square is currently defended by the queen, so he needs that support. Black played bishop to d7, connecting the rooks, developing the bishop. It can't go anywhere better, and it's actually nicely eyeing the important b5 square as well. Okay, Carlsen pushes forward with b4. Rook a c8 was played by Mamedyarov, and it's a good move, trying to get some counterplay here. He's anticipating the c file is about to open, so he's putting the rook on that soon-to-be open file right in line with the white queen, trying to cause a little bit of trouble here. Carlsen also puts a rook on the important c file, which is about to open. And now a mysterious-looking queen retreat. Mamedyarov plays queen to e7. And I believe the purpose of that move is in some lines after white pushes his pawn to b5, as both players anticipate happening, white may be able to exchange a couple of pieces on that square and allow the knight to come to b5, attacking the queen, even if it means his own queen will be hanging in the process. So black backs the queen off so that if a knight lands on b5, it will not be attacking the queen. And in fact, black would like to keep that knight fixed on c3, pinned to the white queen. So it's a defensive prophylactic move here. Okay, Carlsen proceeds with the minority attack. He plays b5, attacking the c6 pawn. So he's threatening to take here, and if black takes back with the b pawn, then as we said, he'll have a very weak, what's called backward pawn on c6. Backward means that it's further back than its neighbors, and it cannot easily be pushed forward, and it can't be defended by friendly pawns, and backward pawns are often very vulnerable by attacks along the file by rooks. So the rook on c1 would be attacking that pawn. And if Carlsen takes on c6, and let's say black decides to take back with a piece like the bishop, well, then the pawn on d5 will be isolated and subject to attack by white's different pieces here. So either way, there's going to be a weakness, and Mamedyarov takes things into his own hands, and he initiates the exchange. He takes on b5. At least he's opening the c file for his rook. Okay, Carlsen takes the pawn back with his bishop since his knight is pinned to the queen. Knight cannot move here. So he takes back with the bishop. Black exchanges a pair of bishops, and white, of course, has to take back with the rook. Okay, now knight e4 comes, putting more pressure on the pinned knight. Okay, we have two attackers on that knight, and we have two defenders, but we don't want the queen to be the lead defender. White can't leave these pieces in this configuration. Black would simply take the knight with either the rook or the knight, and white will not want to recapture with the queen. So what Carlsen does about this situation is he plays queen to b2, keeping both of his defenders on the knight, but allowing the rook to be the one that recaptures if black captures the knight on c3. Notice how awkwardly placed Carlsen's rook is, though, on b5. That rook can easily get attacked. It may get trapped. It may not have any good squares to go to. It's not on a great file right now, the b file. b7 is defended by the queen. Carlsen would love to get that rook back to the c file. Let's see what happens. Okay, knight d6, attacking the rook. However, Carlsen seizes the opportunity here and pounces on black's weakness in the position. The d-pawn is undefended. He doesn't want to take it with the rook and get his rook kind of trapped and tied up there, so he takes it with the knight, attacking the queen. So black has no time to exchange his knight for the rook. Okay, black decides before moving the queen to trade his rook on c1 with check, so white's forced to recapture, and then black moves the queen out of the way. Okay, and this gives Carlsen the time to get his rook back into play and save it by playing rook to c5. So now white is entirely in control of the c file here. So Magnus has an excellent position. He's up a pawn, he's got control of the c file, his pieces are more active. So the opening was a success. Game was fairly short, so let's see it finish. Rook d8 was played. Okay, knight c3. So that knight had some pressure here. The rook is eyeing the knight. The queen is eyeing the knight right there. If this knight moves out of the way, for example, it can go to e4 and attack the rook and simultaneously attack the knight on d5. So Carlsen doesn't want to give up any material. He just brings the knight back to safety here. Mamedyarov plays h6, getting some lift for his king. He anticipates possibly some back rank weaknesses. Carlsen gets the queen into play with queen to a3, which is attacking the a7 pawn and defending the rook nicely. Black plays a6 to protect the pawn. Queen a5, hitting the rook on d8. Okay, queen e8 defending and well defending the back rank. Okay, queen b6. Queen is getting closer to black's side of the board here. And now black makes a kind of a mysterious, pointless move. It's a rapid game. I don't know what the time situation was, but he probably had no moves in the position that could progress his aims. So he made kind of a pointless move here, king to h7. It's actually worse than pointless because it gives up defense of the weak point on f7, and we're going to see Carlsen actually attack that pawn in just a little while. Rook d5. Very nice. The queen is attacking the rook, and now the rook is pinning the knight, because if the knight moves away somewhere, the rook is going to fall on d8. So black moves the rook to safety, rook c8, and counterattacks white's knight. So he gives up his own knight that was pinned in order to counterattack white's knight. However, Carlsen is happy to trade these knights because the knight on d6 is defending the b pawn. So he takes the knight, Mamedyarov has to take Carlsen's knight, and then queen takes b7, and now Carlsen is up 2 pawns in the position. Black has no counterplay, so white is going to win. Let's see how it happens. Rook to c1 check, king h2, the king is perfectly safe on h2. Rook c2 does put some pressure on a couple pawns here, but white doesn't really care. He plays rook d7 and attacks that f7 square that we said earlier black had abandoned. So he's threatening to come in here and then there and attack that black king. So what does black do about it? Well, he plays king to g8 to defend the f7 pawn. He really has no choice. Let's take a look at what would have happened if he did not defend that pawn. Let's say he played rook takes a2. Gaining a passed pawn here, defending his a pawn, winning a pawn back. Well, then comes rook takes f7, attacking the g7 square, threatening to win material. Probably queen g8 is necessary to defend that square. But we have knight d5 bringing another attacker in, and if black exchanges that, then we've got this dangerous passed pawn here that's soon going to make a queen. And by the way, white has a threat in this particular position, queen to b1 check, forking the king and the rook. So that's why black should move the rook. Perhaps rook b2, nice little trick here. The queen is stuck defending the rook, so if white takes the rook on b2, black will take the rook on f7. But we can simply sidestep with a check here, king h8, and we can push this passed pawn. There's nothing black can do in the position. If that pawn gets d7, it's even threatening rook to f8 at that point, pinning the queen to the king. So white is completely winning. So going back to the game, Mamedyarov decided to play king g8 to defend the pawn on f7, but then rook c7 and black resigned. What's the point of that move? Well, Carlsen would like to exchange a pair of rooks here. He's up 2 pawns in the position. That's an active rook on c2. It's threatening a couple of white's pawns, and he's forcing a trade. If Mamedyarov takes and white takes back, then Carlsen has absolutely no trouble in the position at all. He's 2 pawns up. It's an easy win. And the reason black has to take is because if he leaves this file and let's say takes on a2, then white had a second threat, which is rook to c8, pinning the queen, winning the queen for the rook. So black would have no choice there. He could perhaps try the tricky move queen to a4, getting the queen off the back rank so that rook to c8 is not a threat to win the queen, and also defending the rook at the same time. However, we have a little tactic here. White would have played queen to c8 check, and forming a battery down the c-file so that when king to h7 comes, then rook takes c2, winning the whole rook. So there was nothing better than exchanging rooks in the final position and just going down 2 pawns and suffering in that endgame, so black ended up resigning. All right, so thanks for watching this part of our series. We're going to take a look at one more line in the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation before moving on to other lines in the Queen's Gambit. Thanks for watching this video. I'll see you for the next one.